are you going to do the introduction first, or should I start? Oh, sorry.
Just a second. I was going to try and turn up the volume, but I don't know how. I mean,
It's on the soundboard. Oh, on the soundboard.
okay, talk again, Kathy.
Sure. Hi, how's it going?
And now we can hear you better.
Terrific. Thanks for doing that.
Okay, so I'll just do a brief introduction. Thank you guys for coming and, joining the last session. So today we're going to be talking about challenges with collecting survey responses. We have two different sort of, viewpoints. One from the USDA NASS perspective on, we're going to hear a little bit about how they're collecting their survey data and then some issues that they're facing from both Kathy Ott and Kenny, who will present after her. And then we'll touch on some survey issues from the academic side of things when you have to collect your own primary data and some of the stuff that you run into with that. So I think that's it. So Kathy, we have you going for max 15 minutes, and then we'll open it up for some questions, which they can't hear any of the questions. So if people have questions, maybe we'll just have to interpret and restate the questions for you. So, all right, go ahead, Kathy.
Great, thank you. So hi, I'm Kathy Ott, and I'm with the National Agricultural Statistics Service, part of USDA, and I'll be talking about USDA NASS's perspective and challenges with collecting survey responses. And I have nicknamed my presentation the Goldilocks Dilemma, and you'll see why in just a few minutes. So for those of you who don't know, the National Agricultural Statistics Service is the statistical agency of the Department of Agriculture. As such, we publish the official agricultural statistics for the United States. We do that by conducting hundreds of surveys every year to collect data about all aspects of agriculture and agricultural production. And that includes commodity production and prices, demographics about the people who run the farms and ranches in our country, farm practices, economics, labor, chem use, kind of you name it. If it's about agriculture, we collect it. And we collect that data predominantly from farmers and ranchers, although we do conduct some surveys also with agricultural businesses. And the data we collect, as many of you probably know, you're probably some of the data users, impact things like commodity prices, farm programs, including farm insurance, agricultural risk coverage, price loss coverage, ag labor wages, and I put et cetera, because there's, I'm sure, a million more reasons that uses other people could come up with. So the challenges I'm going to talk about today are listed here, but I want to first say that these are not distinct challenges. They all sort of run together and impact each other, particularly response rates and costs. Those two challenges sort of run through all the other ones. And the basic overall challenge we have is related to the fundamental difference between these two groups of people, our data users and our data providers. And the problem comes that they view surveys and data collections differently. So here's where that Goldilocks dilemma comes in. So you see, I have the data users represented in this bed, the picture on the top with the bed, and you see Goldilocks complaining that that data set or that bed is just too small, needs more and more and more, and that's representing our data users. And then we have our data providers who have the opposite perspective, and there's Goldilocks in that big chair is saying, oh, this chair is too big, I get asked for too much information. And that's what I'm going to really focus on today, are these different challenges. I'm going to walk through these now with you. And then I want to remind you all that our job then is to get it just right. This is very difficult to do. So we're trying to balance the too much aspect of our data users and the too little aspect of our data providers and get it just right. So first I'm going to talk about the challenges related to data users. The first of those is data needs. So as many of you probably know, and not only just in agriculture, but in all fields, data needs constantly change. And so we are asked constantly to add more data to existing surveys or change the data we ask on existing surveys. An example of this would be pesticide use. So 20 years ago, there were pesticides that were used that are now illegal to use. So we obviously have to change how we ask about those questions. We don't want to ask about illegally used pesticides. Or maybe we do, but we don't. So there's things like that that change. And also people want to add new questions on existing surveys. But there's also the need for new surveys, and those come about when we have something like new commodities or changing commodities. And Kenny's going to talk specifically about these challenges as they relate to the hemp survey, which is a brand new survey NASS conducted for the first time last year. We also have niche agricultural markets. And for example, we have organic agricultural production and local food marketing. And those topics are so big and so broad that we can't just add questions about them to other surveys. We had to ask brand new surveys to ask about those topics. Similarly, we have agriculture related topics. The last couple of years, we've conducted two big surveys, the agroforestry and one about conservation, that we did ask producers, farm producers and ranchers in our country about, even though agroforestry and conservation aren't necessarily an agriculture topic, but they are related. The next, the next challenge related to data users is data quality. So of course, data users only use our data because it's good data, but that poses some challenges. So the first challenge is that statistics must represent the population we're talking about. And the two main things we do with that is we try to reduce our coverage error, which means that we try to make sure every operation in the country is on our list frame so they can be represented in our surveys. But some types of operations are very hard to find. Particularly small operations. And then in certain states, certain types of operations are also hard to find. Also, new surveys require us to have new data about operations to put them on our list. And again, Kenny will talk about this specifically with the hemp survey and trying to get new operations onto our list frame so they can be represented in our surveys. And then of course, we have to reduce our sampling error by having a really good sample design and a pretty big sample size, depending what population we're trying to represent. In addition to those, another challenge is to reduce our non-sampling error. And to do that, we have to have well-designed survey instruments, and we have to provide them in multiple modes so our respondents can be respondents and respond to our surveys. Which brings us to response rates. So that's, as I said, going to carry through our entire presentation today. Response rates are one of the things that is a huge challenge for us, as well as I'm sure many of you. And we care about response rates because if we have low response rates, we can introduce non-response bias. And that would be where we systematically either over-represent or underrepresent certain groups of people, or in this case, farmers or ranchers. The third challenge related to data users is that data users, like ourselves, like yourselves, don't always see the data provider's perspective. They often think of farmers and ranchers as this like endless open book, just there to provide the data to us. And of course, that's not true. But where we see this happening, or see this concern, is that some of the surveys we're asked to do or that we do ourselves are often long. They can be very detailed, asking for very detailed information that may not seem relevant to the respondents who are answering it. And then in addition, without proper testing, questions may lack an understanding of the topic, and we might lose what we call street cred with our respondents. So for example, during the COVID-19 pandemic, we were asking questions about some of the programs that farmers were being offered, but we were using phrases like the Coronavirus Food Assistance Program or the Payback Protection Program. And people didn't really know what those were. And we didn't want to lose street cred with them. So we had to change the way we asked some of our questions. Now I'm going to move to the challenges related to data providers. And the first is kind of the exact opposite of the challenge I just mentioned for the data users. And that is that the data providers generally don't see the data users' point of view. And in fact, they're generally not data users, which probably explains why they don't see it. And data users are probably not data providers. And so the main users of our data are all levels of government, universities, policy advisors, agricultural businesses, agricultural economists, a lot of you who are probably in the audience today. And so the data providers don't always know how the data get used or even who's using them. And they're not looking at NASS publications on a day-to-day basis like some of the rest of us. So our big challenge here is how to show data providers the uses of the data. The second challenge related to data providers is their complex relationship with policymakers. So as you probably can imagine, the vast majority of our farmers and ranchers are in rural communities and therefore lead a rural lifestyle. So decision makers are often seen as outsiders who don't really know the day-to-day work of the farmers and ranchers. So we often hear that's none of your business. And that can mean one of two things. It can mean a hesitancy to report information to anyone, but it can also mean a very specific hesitancy to report information to us or the government in general. And here our challenge is making sure we have a local knowledge and a local presence in the rural areas throughout our country. The third challenge related to data providers is technology. So in our farm and ranch population, we have lower computer fluency than the general population for several reasons. One is, as we just sort of mentioned, the rural lifestyle and the profession of farming and ranching don't often require everyday use of computers. In addition, and related to that, is that rural access to high quality internet and cell service is often limited. And I was struck by a presentation I saw yesterday where they were talking about the internet quality in different rural areas and how they had improved it so much. And the numbers they were giving, I thought, oh, that's not even close to what I get here in my more suburban house in Fairfax, Virginia. And also, the average age of our farm and ranch operators as of the 2017 census was 58. And that's not really an age demographic of people that typically use day-to-day use of computers or even cell phones. So for this reason, we have to have, if we do have web instruments, we have to have them designed to use pretty low bandwidth. And that makes us reliant on paper and telephone, and even in-person interviews some, but those are more expensive modes to collect and to compile data in. The next two challenges are somewhat related. They're respondent burden and response rate. So I'll talk about respondent burden first. So we look at respondent burden in a few ways, and two of the main ways are the length of a survey and the frequency of surveys. So those are the two I want to highlight here. So when we talk about long and complex surveys, this is an example where we have this this dichotomy between our data users and our data providers. We have a survey called the Agricultural Resource Management Survey, and it takes over an hour on average to complete. And then they have to do it twice because they do the first part on chemical and pesticide use, and then there's another one a few months later on the economics of the farm. So you can imagine, as a data user, that's great, you're getting all this information, but as a data provider, it is quite burdensome. Similarly, keep in mind when you ask a farmer or rancher to complete a survey that some farms and ranches can be in multiple surveys throughout a year or across years. And I have an example here of a farm I just found by accident. I was not looking for a farm that had a lot of burden. I was doing a cognitive interview project for labor, and I came across this farm, and this really strikes me as relevant to this presentation. This farm was quite big, 4,000 acres operated and $9 million value of sales. They had hogs, tobacco, wheat, corn, and several different types of vegetables. But the compelling part is that they were sampled just at NASS for 70 surveys over 5 years. And they did include commodity surveys, labor surveys, economics, cash rents, and several others. So I want you to keep that in mind as we think about burden on respondents. It's not just one survey they're being asked to do. Some of these farms and ranches are being asked to do several surveys. In this case, an awful lot of surveys over the course of a few years. Related to response burden is response rates. So this just shows you the response rates over time of one of our crop surveys. And you see, I did end this in 2019. I did not include the last couple of years because of the COVID-19 pandemic. Our response rates have been all over the place. So I wanted to show you the trend that was before COVID. So you see the trend over the last 10 years before COVID was declining, and the pretty steady decline with very few times when it increased. And I want to point out about that again, the response rates run through most or all of the other challenges that we face. It's one of the biggest challenges we face at NASS. And it's not just declining for NASS or for agricultural operations, it's declining for most, if not even have all, agencies, organizations, and companies. And my guess is most of you have seen this as well if you do any surveys over time. We have at NASS been trying to make some headway on this, and we made some promising strides over the last few years. So a few of the things we've been doing, we've tried to use more administrative data, and this is to try to decrease that respondent burden and hopefully then increase our response rates. Administrative data are data that we obtain from other sources, so we don't have to ask the farmers and ranchers that data. We also are trying to do more targeted non-response follow-up. So we're trying to only do non-response follow-up with those operations that are the most important for the survey. We also are trying to use previously reported data, particularly in our web instruments. And that is where we feed the respondent back information they have reported before. And we're also experimenting with the use of email reminders for some respondents. And I would be remiss if I didn't talk a little bit about costs. As I said, costs are interwoven with all the other challenges, and they impact everything we do. They impact the amount of data we can collect and publish, the quality of that data, the quality of that list frame that I talked about, being able to adequately provide sample sizes that are big enough to do our surveys, And of course, response rates, the big one. And we need more money to use the expensive modes, which are typically in person and telephone, and they get the best response rate. So we really want to continue using them, but you can't do that without money. So costs impact everything that we do at NASS and probably at your agencies or organizations as well. So with that, I'll say thank you, remind you of my agency, the National Agricultural Statistics Service, and my email is there. And I'll answer any questions, and then Kenny will take over and talk about a specific case of challenges at NASS with the hemp survey.
Okay. Do we have any questions online? I don't see any. Are there any questions in the room? Jared?
So you had mentioned in one of those last slides about using previously reported data. Do you mean from earlier in that survey, like in an online setting, or do you mean from other surveys that they had completed from earlier that year? And then how do they respond to that? Like, you're making it more obvious that that they're being tracked by reminding them of their previous responses. How do they feel about that?
I think I heard the question, so I'll try to answer it, but please let me know if I didn't address something.
She's
Oh,
talking about using previous data. What was the term?
So it was the previously reported.
What do you mean when you say previously reported data being used?
Sure. So for our purposes, and different agencies have different ways of looking at this in organizations, but for our purposes, we're using data that was reported by the same operation that is unedited. So something that we didn't think was wrong and change it. And it's on another survey, and it typically would be a recent survey and for a variable that wouldn't change very much. So with our more static variables. And what we're doing is we're taking that data, and I think I heard you say in the question that they know that they're being tracked that way. And that is true. When we give it back to them, they would see it again. We recently did a paper, a colleague of mine and I wrote a paper recently because we did collect in one of our very first iterations of using this in our web instrument, we did collect respondent feedback about those questions. Overall, we had very positive feedback about that, but there were definitely some people who didn't like it. And they gave us some very interesting feedback, the people who didn't like it. But overwhelmingly, people did like having previously reported data there.
And we have another question in the chat box. What do you mean by intending your future research to be AFCFTA specific research? Oh, okay. Okay, yes. How do you balance the long-term issue of hesitancy around federal agencies and data collection, working with the NASDA enumerators help integrate for us enumerated surveys, but what about the others that are self-enumerated?
Yes, so you're correct that working with NASDA enumerators or any other organization that uses enumerators, in-person interviewing and telephone do get better response rates in general than self-enumerated versions like paper and the web. So what we tend to do is we use multiple mode data collection. So we start out by mailing people a letter. Sometimes it's just a letter that tries to push them to the internet and says, here's a web link to go to and your special code you can use. Go online. If they don't respond that way, then we mail them a questionnaire. And if they still don't respond after maybe a couple of mailings, then we start telephoning and then we start the in-person. So we try in general on most of our surveys to give respondents different ways to respond, different modes to respond in. And so that's how we don't do almost any survey that's just mail or just the internet.
Okay. One more quick question. Good question. Given the new Office of Urban Agriculture, how does NASS intend to change surveys to account for this urban agriculture?
So urban agriculture, would be included already if that farm is considered a farm by our definition. Our definition of a farm has been for many years that you produce or normally produce $1,000 in agricultural products in a year. And so they should, in theory, already be on our frame if they are truly a farm. At this point, I don't know of any plans to change our definition of a farm or to have a new definition for urban agriculture. I think the main thing we probably could do is we probably could do a better job of looking in urban areas in our regional offices for urban farms, but they should already be included there. It would just be a matter of maybe we need to oversample them. Maybe we need to work more with them on how they might be different than our traditional farms.
Okay, real quick, one more.
Actually, I just want to add in, I also work at NASS, everything that Kathy said is absolutely spot on. We have made extra effort for the 22 Census of Agriculture to make sure that, we are any sources that we have to capture farm operations that would be defined as farm, vertical agriculture, that sort of thing. It might happen to be in the urban area. They've always been in scope. In the 2018 Farm Bill, as some folks are aware, there was some intent there, but no funding for some survey work surrounding urban agriculture. We did do a pilot in Baltimore, Maryland, and it will be challenging to certain aspects of urban agriculture, the community gardens, that sort of thing. But as part of that's funding.
Okay. All right. Let's move on. I believe Kenny Harrell is next. And so Kenny, would you take the floor?
So I just needed to make sure I got myself off mute. So thanks everyone. Thanks for having me. And yes, as Kathy said, I will be discussing some of the specific challenges that we had starting our new survey to collect data on hemp production in the US. So someone can let me know if I'm sharing in presentation mode. Everything looks okay?
Yes, looks great.
Okay, great. So just a little bit of background for the purposes of the rest of this conversation. Just a brief, very rough timeline of cannabis in the US, and well, really we're starting in the world 10,000 BC. There wasn't really a United States yet, but the hemp and the cannabis product have been around for centuries, millennia, whatever. But in 1937 and then in 1970, these were efforts that the government took to make the cannabis plant and hemp and marijuana products illegal. You can see here, I just put in a couple different state efforts that started where states were sort of challenging the federal laws. So 1996 legalized medicinal marijuana, and then in 2012, Oregon and Washington were the first states to legalize it for recreational purposes. And we've seen many states copy both of those things in the time since. There's still a couple states that sort of hold on to the traditional policy of all products illegal for marijuana. But in 2014, the Congress passed the 2014 Farm Bill that created a hemp pilot program that allowed state governments to opt into an industrial hemp program where they would issue their own licenses. And then in 2018, seeing success with the 2014 pilots, they opened this up to all states. And then at this point, any states that opted in starting in 2018 were maintaining, the USDA was managing the license for those growers, okay? So in around 2019, 2020, NASS and the Agricultural Marketing Service, which is another agency, well, I'm sure you guys are familiar with this, within the USDA, agreed to collect price and production data for industrial hemp. And in 2021, technically October 18th was the mail date, we launched our first ever hemp acreage and production survey. There, in the background, there's also been efforts to add this to the Census of Agriculture, and hemp will appear on the Census of Agriculture for the first time as well. I also wanted to just give a brief rundown for anybody who's not familiar. Maybe many of you are, I'm not sure. But cannabis versus hemp versus marijuana. So cannabis is sort of the main plant from which you could produce either hemp or marijuana. They're essentially distinguished, at least in terms of government guidelines, by a 0.3% threshold of Delta-9 THC. Hemp, we call legally, for legal purposes, we call industrial hemp in the laws. In our survey, nobody really used the term industrial when we were talking with respondents beforehand, so we just shortened it to hemp. Hemp is now legal at the federal level per the farm bills. Marijuana, so over that threshold, still illegal federally, and as I discussed before, laws vary state by state on on the legality for either recreational or medicinal use. So talking about some challenges, many of which Kathy just touched on, some of which were unique to this situation. So the first challenge that we had with this survey was identifying the data needs. And actually, we got off kind of light on this one. This is something that's always common anytime you're starting a new survey. But in this one, we pretty much knew, we had a confined set. We knew, okay, this is keeping in line with other NASS surveys on commodities. We want to know production, we want to know prices, and we want to know acreage and square footage. Also separated by the type of hemp. So hemp could be used for flower products such as CBD or other cannabinoids. It can also be used for fiber and grains. And you can also make propagation stock as a product to sell to other people to grow their own hemp for whatever purpose they want. Being that this was a brand new survey, we had very limited institutional knowledge within the halls of NASS on this product. In our eyes, the product really didn't exist prior to 2014, and certainly we hadn't done a survey on it, so we didn't have any data. But we leaned on our partnerships with AMS, and as well, we had relationship with subject matter experts from academia who specialized in the hemp industry, and they were really invaluable in helping us not only identify the data needs, which we pretty much knew, but sort of the direction that we needed to go in what data we really needed to collect. The second challenge, now this was a tricky one for us. This is identifying respondents. So arguably the hardest part of this survey, unfortunately I wasn't too involved in this part, was creating the frame, and from that frame, the sample. Both of those steps were very, very challenging. And Kathy talked about the importance of reducing coverage error. So we want everybody in our frame who is technically an eligible respondent. So we had two sources for the sampling frame. We had list frame data, which we were able to get from AMS for the states where they manage the licenses. We were able to get a list of producers who had been licensed. So anybody that was part of the hemp growing program after 2018, we had their information if they had applied for a license. However, that all of these states, all of the growers in the states who were not under the AMS management, how are we going to get those? So we worked with an organization to do some web scraping. And the very short version of that is it just went through web pages and found people who grew or sold hemp. What happened is, and this was by design, but we cast a very, very wide net. And so we had a lot of people who either maybe never grew hemp, maybe they were, or at least for our purposes, maybe we, from the web scraping, we incorrectly brought them into the frame, or they applied for a license but didn't grow it, or maybe they did grow it, but they had stopped growing it. So higher than usual for NASS surveys, we had a lot of people that were identified as appropriately being in the sampling frame, but really will probably not be in there going forward. Another quick note about our respondents, and we knew this again from our conversations with our subject matter experts and our relationships at AMS, we figured that the respondents compared to other typical NASS surveys would likely be younger, less likely to be living in a rural area, and also newer to agriculture, given the, sort of the pop culture of the cannabis plant or whatever. There's maybe a heightened interest in growing this, especially once it become legal, that maybe you wouldn't see for corn or soybeans or something like that. So, and specifically what that, the implication for younger and less rural respondents indicates that we might have better success, not just in this survey, but in future iterations of the survey, with having respondents fill out the web survey for us, which has a lot of cost efficiencies and also in a lot of ways can help reduce respondent burden, just given the branching nature of a web survey as opposed to a paper survey. Sorry, that was a quick aside about that specific concern with respondents. So the next challenge, and really the one that Kathy and I, well, me especially, concern ourselves with the most, is turning data needs into questions. So we know, hey, we need to collect this data, but how can we ask somebody about it? And so our method of testing of choice is cognitive testing. And I'll get into that in a minute, but just a brief overview is for this survey, we did it with 27 growers across 8 different states, over 6 iterations of the questionnaire and across 2 distinct rounds. So when I say iterations of the questionnaire, we started out with one very, very basic version of the questionnaire, did a couple interviews, said, oh, actually, we should change this, and maybe we should ask about this, and this might be important to get context on that. And so we continued to make those iterations until the end where we were satisfied with a draft that we had. Why do we love cognitive interviews so much? Well, we like this because respondents tell us what the questions mean to them before it's too late. So before we fielded the survey. So we pre-test the questionnaire and say, hey, in your own words, what is this question asking you? Okay, and how would you answer this question? And so, you know, sometimes they might think that the question means exactly what we wanted it to mean, but we're like, oh man, you came up with that answer? We weren't thinking of that. So that's the, sometimes they're just like, I have no idea what this question means. So we did back to the drawing board in those cases. So doing this helps ensure that A, respondents understand the questions. In doing so, they're seeing terms that they're familiar with. And in cases where we might be introducing terms that there's no way that they're going to be familiar with it, at least we can identify where we need to provide definitions or examples. We also help ensure that respondents are willing and able to provide answers to our questions, which can be tricky if you're asking sensitive issues, such as the primary example would be income or revenue. Some respondents are hesitant to give that up, especially with certain specifics. So again, that's why we love cognitive testing. We can identify all of these potential issues and figure out ways around those problems before the questionnaire goes live. So in the hemp survey, what did we learn? Well, first we learned the prices vary greatly based on the use or type. For example, you could see several $100s per pound for you know, really high grade CBD flower, as opposed to less than $1 per pound for hemp fiber. We also learned about the production practices, and not only that they vary by different types of hemp, but they contribute to the prices. So we made the decision that it is important context to understand whether a grower is taking these production practices, or are they doing them on their own before they sell their product, or are they just selling essentially the basic plant and allowing their buyer to do all of the processing, because doing those production practices adds value. The most prominent of which probably is the extraction of the oil. So if somebody can turn their hemp flower into a CBD oil, that very much adds value to the product. Probably the most important thing that we learned is that the industry, at the time we were doing the interviews, and it seems to be persisting to this day, is still undergoing what several respondents turned to us as the green rush. And essentially, upon the passage of those farm bills, there was the expectation that CBD or industrial hemp products were going to be like the next big thing. So businesses went out to our growers and said, hey, I want to give you this many dollars per pound, grow this, grow this, grow this. It turns out that demand for the product was not there. So with our growers, how that affected them is, in some cases, they the buyer sort of forced them to renegotiate the price for a lower price. They said, hey, listen, I don't really want it for what I was going to give it to you. I can't sell it. How about this instead? And in some cases, they just kind of ghosted our growers. And so what that meant for us is that the typical questions that we ask, particularly for prices, respondents were very hesitant to speculate on the answers. So for example, a typical NASS question about prices would say, what is the price you received for the product that you have sold or will sell? Or how many pounds have you or will you sell in whatever the reference period is? And our respondents saw that question and said, I can't answer that. I'm not going to answer that. And so we had to make a decision to actually separate that out. How much have you sold as of today versus how much have you yet to sell, but you still expect to sell, and what do you think? So at least if they weren't going to answer the question, they could give us what they have sold, and then they could at least feel comfortable knowing, hey, we know you're giving an estimate on this other question. So we tried to alleviate their concerns in that way and still get the best data that we could. So tying it back to challenges, the challenge here is adding and revising questions as they came up during cognitive interviews and being flexible. Challenge number 4, this is related to turning data needs into questions, but as Kathy touched on, really the push and pull between data users and data providers. We want to limit respondent burden. And why do we want to do that? Because burden, whether real or perceived, impacts response rates. And just to specify, when I say real or perceived, real is the actual time that somebody could spend filling out a survey. And if that survey is taking them more than a certain amount of time, they may drop off and say, you know what, I don't have time to finish this. Perceived burden is you get a survey and you just look at it and you're like, that looks like too much. I don't have time to do that. Even if the questions are relatively easy and you could be done quickly. So there is a difference between real and perceived, and both of those impact response rates. However, on this survey, luckily this was less of a concern for us because it was a pretty narrow scope in terms of what we wanted to collect. And so that really did help limit the respondent burden. We estimated for OMB purposes, and what we told the respondents is that we estimated 15 minutes. It was likely much less for operations that maybe only grew hemp flower, as opposed to other operations who may have grown for separate uses, and now they have to fill out multiple sections. We also noticed in these cognitive interviews that respondents were able to give pretty precise answers with relatively little effort. So that's like the words escaping, the holy grail for us in terms of a burden perspective, because they don't have to go through our records to get precise answers. They can do it right off the top of the head, and they're not just nice round numbers. And then the last challenge that I want to address today, there were more challenges, but for the sake of brevity, I'm keeping it to 5. The last one here was finding the right timing to launch this survey. So for this first iteration in 2021, we settled on a survey date of November 1st of the collection year. And that was done purposefully as we understood that pretty much everybody would be done with their harvest at that point. And so again, survey date, November 1st, actually mailed out October 18th. And so again, we did conduct it late in the year to capture the full year of harvest. In practice, though, there were a few issues. So not all harvests were complete, particularly in areas where climates maybe allowed you to extend that harvest season into the fall. Perhaps maybe the harvest was complete, but you hadn't yet weighed it yet, or you didn't have all of the information you would need. So maybe you were just done with the harvest. In addition, people who grew hemp under protection, such as greenhouses, hoop houses, tunnels, things of that nature, they could theoretically grow year round. Okay. And so the other issue related to that, as we kind of touched on before with hesitancy to speculate on prices, many operators couldn't or wouldn't report what they had yet to sell. So if they hadn't really kind of what we touched on before, if they hadn't sold a certain amount of pounds, they may have been hesitant to classify it as this is something I will sell versus something that maybe I don't know if I'll sell it. And furthermore, hesitant to speculate on what those prices could be. And briefly, let me go back to that issue before. In other NASS surveys, it is easier to ask respondents to estimate prices. For example, for a farmer who's been growing corn for decades, they can say, well, this is what I get every year depending on the markets, and this appears to be what the market conditions are now. So even if I haven't sold it, I have all of this history with this product that I can give you a pretty solid estimate. We had new growers here, many of whom were completely new to agriculture. And in addition, selling a product that by nature did not have a legal market to be sold prior to 2014 at all. So not only a new product, but again, new operators with this product and potentially to agriculture as a whole. So that's it for me. Again, there are more challenges. I'm sure many of you could probably think of a couple off the top of your head, but that's it for me. Let's go ahead and field any questions if you have them.
Okay, do we have any questions? I'll be happy to repeat them. Interesting challenge.
Interested in 2022, when are you planning to send out the survey then?
The question is, what are your plans for the 2022 survey?
Thank you for bringing that up. Really, we actually found that most of the questions, thanks to that period of time that we were afforded with cognitive testing to really develop the questions, most of them hit the intent that we want. We are going to be fielding the survey. We are pushing data collection back 3 months. So I do appreciate you bringing that question. So because of the reasons that I mentioned on that the last slide, that maybe the harvest wasn't complete or maybe they hadn't sold it yet, 3 extra months should definitely allow for that harvest to be complete. Hopefully people will have weighed it and at least know the full data of the production that they were able to get. as well as 3 extra months to sell the product. And so maybe moving people from that, oh, I'm hesitant to estimate what I haven't yet sold. Well, now 3 extra months, maybe you can give us a price that you have sold. So.
Okay. All right. We had an online question about, was the hemp survey piloted? If so, what were the results? If not, how do you intend to adjust given the data from this year and future years?
The piloting or the pre-testing was limited to those interviews that we did beforehand. So it wasn't piloted as a questionnaire as a whole. Kathy can actually give a little bit more info. So we have probably, I believe, in the Census of Agriculture test, piloted the hemp questions for that, which collects some of the same information, although not as in great detail, but it also is presented sort of along with other commodities that could be grown in fields, as well as a separate section for under protection. So it's collected there. And so that was tested in the Census of Agriculture content test. As far as adjustments that we're making forward, we're actually taking a couple questions off. And one adjustment that we saw that we want to make just to ensure things. We didn't really notice any big issues with this. We wanted to make sure that when respondents are giving us their weight, that they're giving us the dry weight. Now, we asked a question about, did you dry the hemp? But in theory, they could have dried the hemp and still only known the weight from before it was dried. So we are now asking an explicit question, is the weight that you're providing is this the dry weight? Okay. And then going forward, we'll continue to make adjustments as the as the industry evolves. We noticed a couple things coming up in the other things such as microgreens that people could eat, and that didn't fit neatly into one of our categories. We've also noticed, for anybody that's really familiar with the field, you already know about this, but Delta 8 THC, which is sort of a loophole around the law, which calls for the provision of Delta 9 THC. So right now, Delta 8 THC is technically considered industrial hemp per the terms of this law. That is my understanding. If somebody grew a flower that was below the threshold on Delta 9 THC, but grown specifically to have Delta 8 THC, which then has to be sort of synthetically altered to be a usable product, from my understanding. But that is something that is, again, sort of a loophole around. And so I don't know to what extent the questionnaire will be able to address that. We do not have anything addressing that specifically on this version of the questionnaire. I hope I answered your question. There's probably a multiverse of ways this can go as the industry evolves, and changing legality of hemp or marijuana, if that ever happens. So,
Joe, did you want to comment? Yeah, Kenny, great job. One quick point I was going to make is Kenny had shared that we did some web scraping. It's a long story, but there's kind of some holes last year where the regulation, depending on whether you're in certain states or on tribal land and stuff, which farm buildings are under. Fortunately, the next iteration of the survey will not need a web scrape because the ANS licensing list should be complete for us. Although it is possible that a few of those folks we've got to talk to won't actually have to data, like not to go all the way through the process. But so that'll be one pretty large simplification.
May I ask a question of any of you to know, to what degree are your sampling frame now, including people that were never farmers previously?
Kenny, I don't know, you may have some more insight. I think it really depended some upon where you're growing and also what you were growing. I think that the folks that were growing for fiber or for seed were very high propensity that they were already represented on the list. They were Eastern Montana wheat farmers kind of folks.
Okay.
Right. I think that some other subcategories probably less so. We were adding folks.
Okay. All right.
Just to add on to that, if we have time, if not, I can talk about it, later on.
Real quickly.
Yeah, sure. I would just add to that in some states, there was already an existing infrastructure as the processes for tobacco can be similar. So states like Kentucky or North Carolina that had tobacco growers. So the short answer to your question is qualitatively more than usual. People were new growers. Quantitatively, that isn't something that we've looked at yet. However, I think we did collect in the demographics section, when did you first start farming? And I think that we might be able to at least start pointing in the direction there with that. So I'll cut my rambling there and let you get on to the
Okay.
next presentation.
All right. Thank you very much. We'll move
Thank you.
on with the session. I think Jared is next, correct? So Jared Penn will be up next.
Right. Can I get a thumbs up? Oh, I can't. Can't. I would like to see the thumbs up.
A verbal thumbs up. It looks good.
Yeah. Great. Thank you. Wonderful. Thank you guys for being here today. Really appreciate your time and really learning a lot from the NASS folks. So it's been really good. So this is looking at it more from the side of, how can we think about addressing some of these challenges? The first part you're going to see, we'll go through very quickly because we've established the challenges of getting farmer and landowner survey responses. And then this idea of how to improve on it. And we've got two case studies so we'll see two different case studies. So the idea is payment that we often are using in order to incentivize responses versus the separate idea of charitable donations in order to incentivize response rates. So okay, great. So declining participation in surveys, we see it in multiple venues. And we know that it's true also among agriculture surveys that it's been declining. And, a consequence of that, as you have declining response rates, it becomes more expensive to acquire those responses. So we need to be thinking about, all right, if we're going to get back to some level of parity, how expensive is that going to be? Okay. And so there's been a few papers, AEPP papers that sort of have talked about, all right, what are the consequences of, say, going out into the field, having to collect a response by hand versus, say, just giving that person $50 and avoiding all of that additional labor cost. Okay, so solutions, increasing sample size, that's not really feasible when you've got a limited frame of the population. When you're talking about farmers, you can't, if you're a consumer, that's easy. You just move on to the next person. But for a farmer group, you have to just incentivize that existing group. Thinking about additional follow-ups, thinking about branding. If you basically say, hey, this is University X, there might be some additional value or trust there that gets additional responses. Of course, the things that we've talked about before, survey length, effort, thinking about the sensitivity of the questions, thinking about those follow-up reminders. And one of the ones that has come up more and more often, I see it more frequently, is payment for participation. Just saying, hey, we're going to give you $10, $20, $50 if you're going to be willing to sit down with us or to take our survey. I still feel, just in my own experience, that you still have to keep it short. I'm not sure that, the difference between $10 and $20 is going to make a difference as it relates to, say, more than 15 minutes, that max threshold. Okay. The other issue is that it may matter as to who the respondent is. $10 or $20 may not go very far when they're operating $1 million farm. Okay. So the other major thing, especially as you're doing direct payment in a university setting, is that the labor cost of processing those payments. That is a frustrating thing that if I say I'm going to go collect 200 responses, that means, and when I did this before, it was 200 W-9s. And at LSU, I have to get Social Security numbers. And so I have avoided that like the plague. Okay. The other challenge there is it could be jeopardizing anonymity, delayed payment. And so Instead, some have looked at the idea of charitable donations. For me, what I like the most about it is that it substantially lowers administrative effort. Rather than having to make 200 payments, let's suppose that 100 of those individuals say, I'm willing to forego that money and instead have it be donated to, say, 2 charities. So those 100 payments now become 2 payments to the 2 charities. And that is a lot less administratively burdensome than, say, sending out the 100 checks. So at the very least, maybe at least just having it as an option could be valuable to us, okay? It could also be useful in terms of, again, thinking about the marginal utility of income. $10 may not mean very much to a person if they're already, making $100,000, but a $10 donation to their favorite charity may be much more meaningful to them, okay? So the contribution of this is to think about charitable donations relative to direct payments in terms of increasing farmer participation and forest landowners. So the first one I actually presented this a few years ago here at AAEA, and we'll go through this pretty quickly. What we were basically doing was trying to get a little bit on edge management among Kentucky soybean farmers. All right, I was working with some of the entomologists, and we were trying to say, or they were trying to understand, okay, would you be willing to manage your field edges a little differently in order to promote pollinators? And they were nice enough to let me add on a few questions about, hey, how burdensome are surveys? One important point, though, is that the way that we recruited these farmers is through a listserv of FFA basically announcing it and saying that we would donate $5 to the local FFA chapter for their response. And that is important as to the results that we're going to see. And about 150 usable responses. Okay, very, very, very short survey. It was meant to be, I think, 5 minutes, something along those lines. And in terms of testing this idea of donations versus payments, what we did was a randomized sort of a between sample experiment where discrete choice experiment, where we, at the end of the survey, after they had done the entomological and field edge part, we asked them, suppose we were going to approach you and participate in several surveys. Okay, would you be willing to, in this example, would you be willing to sign up to do 1 survey this upcoming year for $20? Would you prefer to do 3 surveys for $30 or opt out? And this is a choice experiment. Each person only saw the 1 scenario, and the real benefit there is that you don't have to explain all the nuance of a choice experiment if they're literally just seeing the 1 scenario. And then they are followed up where they see the same scenario and instead asked, okay, suppose in the first setup, it was donation. And in the second follow-up question, it's, all right, what if you were paid? What would you do? Okay, half of the individuals, they see the donation and then followed by payment, and the other half, the exact opposite. Okay, we did have the chance to ask a few other questions that might be of interest to folks. Basically, how often are you doing USDA surveys? How often are you doing other surveys? The inconvenience level of USDA surveys versus other surveys. NASS, I'm sorry to say that they think yours are more burdensome than the university surveys. They're not getting paid very often, though. All right, so what are we thinking about? We're thinking that if donations work better because people have a higher marginal utility for the charitable donation, we're hoping that they're less likely to opt out. We hope that they are more responsive to a donation incentive relative to a payment. We're thinking that, more surveys, just the main effects, more surveys are bad, more incentive is good. Okay, so a basic result here, it follows what we would expect, that more incentive, can't see my pointer. More incentive is good, more surveys are bad. This part is surprising to me. This negative opt-out coefficient means that they would prefer not to opt out. I would have expected that the preferred answer is, I prefer to opt out from taking your surveys. But remember, this is hypothetical, and the sample frame of, we've already told them we're going to donate $5. So, the people who are opting into taking our survey are different than the population, okay? As it relates to the donation, we just add in a few interactions, and we see that if you do it as a donation, you are even opting out is even less desirable. So basically, they are more likely to opt into taking a survey, to that idea that donations increase participation rates. Okay. And again, right here, this positive coefficient, the data were pretty limited. So nothing showed up as significant, I believe, for the all 3 interactions, which is something like the evidence is rather weak. And so when we look at it though with the individuals, then sure, significant coefficients pop up. Okay, but these sort of things point to the idea that donations could work in this hypothetical scenario. Okay, maybe, and the maybe in terms of this could potentially work, but the two big things that sort of made me want to push for a second case study, hypothetical bias, asking people, are they willing to participate in extra surveys next year for hypothetical payments could be a challenge. And then again, the self-selection piece, that people who are already taking the survey are doing so because they are receiving a $5 donation, leading us to the second case study. This was with NIFWIF, and we were basically looking at forest landowners in northern Louisiana and southern Arkansas. We don't know very much about these landowners. All we know is that the location and the acreage according to the property tax records, okay? And so we implemented this survey where 5 waves pre-notification. The first wave was online only. Then the reminder, and the second wave with the survey was online and a mail. So mixed mode, but with this push to web approach in order to try to use it for other experimental purposes. Okay, so the experiment in this case is that we sent out about 4,000. The 4,000 were divided among 5 treatments. Okay, either receiving no incentive for taking the survey, a $5 payment for $5 Amazon gift card, $10 Amazon gift card, a $5 donation to Project Learning Tree, which is, I can't remember if it's associated with one of the forestry foundations. $5 to Project Learning Tree, $10 Project Learning Tree, with the idea that if you choose a charity that is relevant to the population, they're going to be more likely to be responsive, okay? The online payments took place about 2 to 4 weeks after their response. And if it was a mail response, it took even longer, 4 to 6 weeks, okay? And again, we're choosing this particular charity because we think it may be more relevant to their population. Okay, so what are we hoping to see? Basically, do payments and charitable donations work better than no incentives? Do more payments, higher payments work better than lower payments? The same thing is true for donations. And then the idea of marginally, going back to the idea of which has more value to the respondent, is a $5 donation worth more than, say, a $5 payment? And the same thing for $10. Okay. So this one takes a little bit, but this was the number of delivered responses, 4,000. Okay, evenly divided across the 5 treatments. Okay, you can see that our overall response rate is about 14%, and it's about 6% came from online and another 8% came from mail. So the first important thing for this population means I think the mail surveys still have a really, really important place in the work that we do when we're talking with forest landowners. And especially here, the forest landowners are typically, much older, similar to producers, okay? So mail is still important. Now, looking across these combined responses, you see that the control group had about a response rate of 14%. And then you go across and you see that these really aren't impressive, okay? As it relates to the marginal gain relative to the baseline 14%. So, and these are just some of the tests, and you don't see any letters here because it means that none of them were significantly different. So the response rate was equivalent in all 4 treatments, okay? Now, if we decompose this a little bit, we can see some information, some differences with respect to online and mail surveys. So if you're looking right here, if you look at, let's say, donation 5 versus payment 5, looking at some of those, I think it was hypothesis 4, this is significantly higher than this. And then for $10, the $10 payment is significantly higher than the $10 donation. Okay, so at least in an online setting, we are better off using direct payments, okay? That you are worse off using donations. Now, going to a mail survey, everything's back to being equivalent. So you don't lose anything by doing a donation in a mail survey. from the perspective of administration, reducing administrative costs, what that means is that it's still useful to have a donation, because for some people, if they choose that option, again, just less paperwork. Okay. So yeah, the takeaways here are donations work better in mail than they do online. You'll notice that right here. So, and but again, it's largely equivalent as it relates to mail surveys. One other important thing that I thought was worth looking at is you get a lot of unusable responses, especially in mail surveys, because people tend to skip a lot more material. And so we using this just arbitrary cutoff of 85% finished. Did they answer 85% of the questions? How much do the results change? And so we still have a similar setup in terms of the randomization. Our response rate falls to about 11% overall when we're sort of holding it to being a more complete survey response. And in this case, we do see a little bit more information going on, that donations are actually doing worse even in the combined response compared to the payments and the control group. But most of the conclusions are the same in the sense that payments are fairly consistent. Donations, mail is still important. Donations still tend to work better in the mail setting as compared to the online setting. So to me, there are, I also ran a regression, and this regression again is very simple in the sense that I'm doing this of the entire population, of the entire 4,000 respondents, or the entire 4,000 landowners. And so the amount of information I have is just population and just the reported acreage from the tax assessment. And so this is somewhat sensible in that the more acres they own, the more likely they are to respond. We don't see, I include the fixed effects or the location, but these results are just generally showing there's not much going on with respect to payments and donations, which in some ways is disappointing in that donation payments aren't going to give us much of a bump either. Okay. And again, some using that 85% usable response rate, just, completing the survey at higher level, not much is going on over here. So I really don't find, it's a sort of a null results paper, not much evidence to support the idea that donations are better, that that payments or donations are working better than even no payment at all. I still think though that, just again at the premise that donations reduce burden. I think that even as just giving it as an option, that could be a different way of looking at that, is to say, all right, if we did another experiment, it'd be donation, payment, and then the third treatment would be donation plus payment, or even giving them more of those options of like, what if it was to the charity of your choice? What if it was to the localized charity? But I guess I'm not convinced by any means, and think that we're gonna have to keep looking for more opportunities for improving response rates. Okay, that's all I've got.
One quick question. Everybody? There's one. Sure. So do I understand correctly that if you're making payments to people, you need them to collect their social security number? Yeah.
No.
How did you put a check in the mail to the address?
Yeah, so okay, the question was the way that this is important. So dealing with payments at LSU is extremely difficult. And so so the quick answer is you find a third-party contractor who can make those payments for you. And that's been my answer. But the donation piece is also a workaround in that case. They didn't have any challenge with that. Because again, if the issue is if it's the university making the payment to the individual, then they want, all of the information. As long as someone else is handling the money, it solves some of those challenges. No, yeah, thanks.
I can't run a non-Mac computer, so
Okay.
sorry.
This one?
Yeah, that one.
think it's still sharing. Good.
Right now, what we're seeing is sort of the presenter mode,
Okay.
which is fine. I mean, it's as long as you're okay with us seeing the next slide.
All right, does that look better?
Yes.
Okay, great. So, yeah, so Jared set this up pretty well for me. So we did a survey and we tried to incentivize our beekeepers to respond. We did this online because we did it during COVID. And so I'm here to tell you, I guess, kind of give you a nightmare story about what could happen if you do all of the wrong things. So yeah, that's what I'm here to do. So okay, so basically just to give you some context of what we were doing in this online survey. So what we wanted to do was measure the value that beekeepers actually attribute to bee-friendly cover crops planted in almond orchards. The cover crops provide nutrition, which is valuable to the beekeeper. And so to do that, we created a discrete choice experiment and needed to distribute that online. And we only wanted to target beekeepers that participate in almond pollination services. I guess many of you may not have context, but almonds require pollination services, and it's a big deal. So we'll just leave it at that. So when we're talking about beekeepers that participate in almond pollination, we're talking about a fairly small subset of beekeepers. Like USDA counts every beekeeper, USDA NASS counts a beekeeper as anyone with greater than 5 colonies. For almond pollination, we're trucking bees in from New York, Florida, the East Coast. So you're not going to bring 5 colonies to California. That's not going to pay well. So we're only talking about large commercial beekeeping operations. So I've kind of highlighted the population that we expect to see, or we expect to be sampling from. And those are beekeepers with only over 300 colonies, because a truckload of colonies is about 450. So we're looking about 1,000 operation, a little over 1,000 beekeeping operations that we're going to be trying to get a sample from. So that's pretty small. USDA has some beekeeping surveys, but just to give you an idea of what kind of we were looking at going into doing this survey, Bee Informed Partnership does a colony loss survey. They've been doing it for 15 years now. It's a nationwide survey. For 2022, they had about 90 beekeepers that were a sideline. I have it, 51 to 500 that responded to their survey, and about 45 commercial beekeepers, which would definitely fall into our category with greater than 500. So only, about just over 100 beekeepers, and this is a survey that's been going on for 15 years. So knowing that, and there's a couple of other pollination surveys which are very low response rates. And so we knew that we needed kind of a robust marketing strategy to get enough responses for our choice experiment. So this is sort of how we marketed it to beekeepers. We worked with the beekeeping industry to get some direct email contacts. So we had about 250 direct emails that we sent out a specific link to those emails. And then we also distributed anonymous links through a couple of different areas. Some were emailed to email blasted out over American Honey Producers Association and Project Apis M. And then we also had a couple of places that we advertised them. Project Apis M shared which is a big beekeeping nonprofit group. I forgot to say that, but they shared it on their social media to try and get more engagement. And also the folks at Bee Culture Magazine, which is one of 2 beekeeping magazines, they shared it on their website. and the Commercial Beekeepers Facebook page also. So unforeseen problem happened when these anonymous links were shared. These were publicly available, and I had no knowledge that there were bots out there trolling the internet looking for surveys to participate in. So this is, I guess you can't really see this, but these were the two real publicly available posts. So the one on the right is Project APSM. One on the left is obviously Bee Culture. I've highlighted that we put right in, or they put right in the posts, $20 for your participation in this survey. It'll take you 20 minutes to do. And so just in case anybody is not aware what a bot is, because I obviously wasn't before this, so they're computer software that's designed by a human to perform some automated tasks like searching the web for surveys that say that they offer $20 to take them, or they will also complete surveys as well. And I talk a lot about bots completing our surveys here. I recognize that it also could be if you have people in other countries that where the wages are low enough, it might make sense to have them take the surveys as well. But I'm just talking about bots, but it can be interchangeable. It's just easier to say. So this is what things looked like. So we released the survey February 15th. We're trickling in a few responses. On February 19th was when we posted on Bee Culture. We got an uptick, which looked great, but semi-reasonable. So it's unclear if those are bot responses or just beekeepers. Then we got to February 22nd when Project APSM posted it on their Instagram page. And then we had thousands of responses just overnight. And if you remember back to how many beekeepers we thought were in our population, we have more responses there than are in that population that we're expecting. So by about 9:40 in the morning on February 23rd, we had to shut that anonymous link down. We just had to close it because we were just going to keep getting inundated with the bot responses. So final total was about 110 real responses and 2,500 bots or humans maybe in other countries. So just to kind of take you through all of the steps that we went through as a cautionary tale in case this ever happens to you. I hope it won't. But so step number one, we were panicking. We had no idea what to do. Step number two was, of course, go to Google. And so we just started Googling, you know, what do you do if you're getting all of these bots or whatever they were. There was mostly blog posts at this point. I'll share later on some literature that I forgot I was going to move forward. But now there's slowly starting to come more like academic articles about bots and surveys, but at this time I didn't find very many. So it was mostly blog posts about this is what you should do, this is what you should not do. I contacted Qualtrics and learned that UC Davis doesn't pay for bot protection. So that was a little discouraging because I had no idea that I should even pay for bot protection. The next step was to add this Recaptcha question. Unfortunately, it did not work. It slowed incoming responses. I could see them slow down for about 5 to 10 minutes when I added that, you know, that question that you answer, I'm not a robot. But then they just started right back up again. I also tried randomizing the order of when the Recaptcha question comes up, and still it was similar. So that was not working. The next step was try and implement, because we really didn't want to shut the survey link down because we're trying to get as many beekeepers as we can. So we didn't want to shut it down. So then we thought about it. Jared and I talked about it. We'd implement questions to try and identify the bots in the data afterwards. And I'll talk more specifically about what we did, but there was little to no success there. So the next step was to shut down that survey link and make a new link. And then we sent the new links out. They made them password protected, and told Project ABSM, please don't share this on your social media anymore. And then we had to also then, of course, clean the data to remove fake responses. So the lessons that we sort of took away from this is once these bots infiltrate your survey, it's very difficult to stop. So obviously we ended up having to shut that survey down. What did work was a Facebook verification feature of Qualtrics where they have to log in to Facebook in order to complete the survey. Obviously that adds more response burden onto that. As well as password protecting adds a little bit more response burden. So that created additional hurdles for potential participants, which we didn't really want to do. So what we figured out is you can use a unique link for each anonymous survey that you have. And actually, so if one link gets compromised by bots, then you can send that link specifically through Facebook verification, and then the rest of the links don't have to do that. So that was one way we kind of worked around it. And because we did end up having Project ABSM share again with the password and more bots came, and yeah, but anyways, identifying bots is pretty difficult. So we had to, look through the data. Luckily, because universities are complicated in how you can pay out, it was not automated. So it wasn't like we were giving, 2,500 bots their payment. But I went through the survey first and sort of looked at them and thought what I saw, like picked out the ones that I thought were reasonable. And then Mari, a PhD student, also did more of a technical way of going through it where she went through and kind of like coded in R different things that would flag fake responses. And then we did a comparison between the two. And so there was a lot of overlap between what we both found with our different methods, but we did find real responses. I found ones that the code didn't get, and vice versa. So there was some merit to doing both checks there. And I'm probably running out of time, but yeah, so then we also sent some messages like over email to verify whether they were real humans or not, but bots, either they or their humans will email you. So that was kind of interesting to learn. There's the identifying the bots by these were survey questions that we attempted to put into the survey, and keep in mind it was while the survey was live. So I was trying not to change too much in there. We added these honeypot questions that humans can't see. You use JavaScript, but then the bots might answer. None of the bots answered those questions. Randomizing easy fill in the blank questions worked because they would sometimes think that that question was coming up next, but it was really the other random question. So then you could identify them that way, or asking the same question at the beginning and the end of the survey worked a little bit. But you have to use fill in the blank both times, which again, you're kind of balancing between response burden and identifying these bots. And so when Mari went through and did the checking in R, it was very clear that you can't use records like location or IP addresses. They're way smarter than that. So we went through and flagged all of these things, and institutional knowledge or inconsistent answers are ways to flag the bots way better than, these IP addresses are. And so you can see this one is the main one that, well, I don't know where this one is the main one that I looked at, and it was, we asked how many colonies they rented across North, Central, and Southern California. And so the bots would oftentimes say 1, 1, 1. And so you know that a beekeeper is not going to truck one colony to each region. And so that's how we ended up flagging a lot of them. They answer, they have like this distribution of response times, so you can't identify them by just a really quick response time. I won't go through this because I'm out of time, but they're long answer questions. There were some that I would pick out and I would think this is really crazy. This must be a bot, but it was really an actual beekeeper. So it was really difficult. This is what I was wanting to say earlier, but I forgot to put this earlier. So this problem isn't just for surveys that you do on your own. So there's a lot of research that's coming out now saying that, you know, there could be these problems also in the Qualtrics panels or MTurk. And so this is something we definitely need to be thinking about as a profession, like how good is our data quality. So yeah, don't share on social media if you can at all help it. If you have to share on social media because you need more responses, you really need to think about these bots beforehand. Check with Qualtrics, make sure you have the right software that you need. Definitely don't automate the gift card payment because we would have been out a lot of money had it been automated. Yeah, so I think that's pretty much it. So yeah, thank you. Yes.
So you mentioned there's a service for bot protection provided by Qualtrics. So I mean, how much is it? Like
I don't know. I didn't ask because I was already in the midst of this. So I will ask the next time that if I try and do one of these surveys that I know, well, I'll definitely do it just because you don't know if somebody's going to share your survey online on their, you know, Facebook without you knowing it. And you could get bots that way as well. Just like somebody sees it like, oh, everybody should do this survey. And then so yeah, I don't know how much it would be, but I would definitely recommend looking into it if you're. It may be, they may put more of, you know how, because I like that question that came up where you just check the box was the only Recaptcha that came with our Qualtrics license. They might have the ones where you have to choose the different pictures and make sure. They also put like I know that they put like an index on whether or not, like how probable it is that this response is a bot. And I don't know what all goes into that. Yeah, so. And do we have any other, I mean, we can have questions for any of the other presenters now too.
Oh, Brittany, actually, I wanted to ask first, Jared and Brittany, both of your presentations were really awesome. Very, very informative. I'm a little bit jealous, but I'm glad I didn't have to follow you. You know, one observation, a good thing about NASS not providing incentives is we don't have to worry about bots filling out the survey for the incentive.
Yes.
But separately, sort of a maybe half serious, half silly question. How long did it take until, like, when you saw these responses rolling in, was there like a moment of elation where you're like, wow, something, word of mouth must be popping off right now? And then like it slowly transitioned to like, this isn't right. Or were you immediately like, this is clearly not right? Like the first.
I mean, it was pretty immediately clear. I mean, when we had gotten like 5 responses in a day, 2 days before that from direct emails, I mean, I was like, okay, getting 100 responses right now is not, I mean, this is so, and they would start, like you could see them starting, they would start surveys one right after another, like every single minute or something. There would be a new survey started. They would take like different times to finish the survey, but they would start pretty regularly. So it was pretty apparent very quickly.
Cool, thank you.
I don't need to go into steps, but like thanks for documenting all this for everybody to see. I will just say one thing about it, which is that we had the survey for 3 weeks, and I was trying not to be obsessed about monitoring how many responses we got. I checked and I was like, oh cool, we got 3 responses. That's way more than the first round of the survey. And, you know, oh cool, we got 150 responses. and then I had to analyze it. I started looking at it. It looked like right. Actually, the email address.
Yeah, the email addresses. Yeah. Kathy and Kenny, if you didn't hear that, John Bove was just saying how he had a similar experience and was excited about all of the responses, but then realized later that it was not right, primarily through email, funky emails that they put in.
Really glad you mentioned that because the consumer survey folks, we haven't really faced that issue. Brady messaged me, it's like, this is not something like, we're worried about the quality of the respondent and professional survey takers. But I've been asking around for months and just trying to find folks who had a bot attack. And just to know that this is something that isn't, we're not the only ones.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, it's so funny. I walked in here based on the title of the session. I didn't realize this was a topic, and then I saw it. Wow, cool. Why have we gone?
Cool and not cool at the same time. Like, yeah, but most of the stuff that I found about bots online has taken place like in psychology or in other places, anywhere where you're trying to just get like, general population or like a very small subset of the population. So you're just trying to like market it a lot is where it seems to be. And then, yeah, it seems to be a problem there. And then I just can't even imagine if we didn't have that region question in our survey that identified the bots pretty much immediately. Like, I don't know how in like a general population survey, you would have those such questions that are so niche that a bot or human programmer wouldn't know how to answer it. So it is a little scary, especially for some of those Qualtrics surveys or panel surveys that are going out. Yeah.
I've used Qualtrics. Both is just design of an instrument. I've also had them pull a sample for me from the thing. So you're not saying they have a bot problem with their kind of standard?
No, they may. There's a specific one of the literature that I cited looks specifically at Qualtrics and whether I think it was like called whether it's bots or inattentive participants. And I think they found an issue with potential bots in the Qualtrics panel. So, yeah.
Okay. They have bot protection. They basically will flag a lot of the responses for you. And they're doing a lot of the same thing that you're describing. It's just like, okay, they failed 4 out of 5 from our checks, or they have too many nonsensical responses. But on the flip side of that, you still have to be mindful because let's say, for example, you have an open-ended response or like an other. Basically, some of the respondents think that they're not allowed to leave a question blank at all, and so they may just put in nonsense in order to move forward.
Oh.
So it may not always be the case that nonsensical responses always indicate a bot, and it's the Pandora's box.
All right. I think that's it.
Thank you.
Thanks. Thanks, Kathy and Kenny. It's great seeing
Thank
you
you.
guys.
Thanks for having us.
All right, thanks, everyone.